The bell above the deli door chimed softly as Brian held it open for Julia. Warm air, fragrant with baked bread and simmering soups, wrapped around them as they stepped inside. The place was modest but inviting. Handwritten chalkboard menus, glass display cases stretching the length of the counter, and a steady hum of low conversation from scattered tables. They moved side by side toward the long refrigerated case where salads were displayed in neat rows. Over a dozen options lined the shelves, each labeled carefully, each layered with color and texture. Brian hadn't exaggerated. There was variety here, and quality too. Julia leaned slightly closer to the glass, scanning each option with quiet concentration. Her eyes moved methodically, the same way they might review evidence before trial, observant, selective, precise. She paused at one in particular. Cranberry raisin salad, sliced apples, fresh spinach, grilled chicken, a small packet of balsamic vinaigrette resting neatly against the container. "That one," she said, more to herself than to Brian. He nodded approvingly. Solid choice. His own tastes were simpler, predictable even. He selected a standard Caesar salad, grilled chicken on the side, no dressing. Clean. Straightforward. 2 Diet Cokes and 1 share-size bag of potato chips completed their meal. At the register, Brian pulled cash from his wallet, folded bills he had organized earlier that afternoon. He paid without hesitation, declining the receipt. It was a small gesture, but intentional. This evening mattered to him. They stepped back out into the cooling air, paper bags rustling softly in Brian's hands. "Where to next?" Julia asked. "My place," Ryan responded. There was a pause, not an awkward one, no discomfort, no misinterpretation, but a pause nonetheless. A space where implications existed quietly between them. Sensing the gap, Brian added gently, "You need not worry, Julia." "I'm not," she replied evenly. The exchange settled whatever unspoken concern might have surfaced. Trust had entered the evening, not dramatically, but firmly. They drove in companionable silence through streets that gradually shifted in character. The storefronts became older, the sidewalks narrower, streetlights cast longer shadows. Ryan turned down a side street and parked behind an old brownstone apartment building. 3 stories tall, faded brick, windows that had weathered decades of seasons. It sat in what most would politely describe as the economically challenged part of town. "This is me," Brian said, lightly. They exited the truck and walked toward the back stairwell. The steps creaked under their weight as they climbed. At the top floor, Brian unlocked a narrow door and gestured for Julia to enter first. The studio apartment was exactly what its size suggested. A queen-size bed, neatly made with hospital corner precision, occupied one wall. A small desk and chair sat near the window. A single night lamp rested on a wooden crate, doubling as a bedside table. A 32-inch television perched atop a narrow nightstand, beside a PlayStation and a modest stack of games. Against another wall sat a mini-fridge. Inside were 6 bottles of water and a half-eaten tuna fish sandwich that looked as though it had survived at least a month too long. The bathroom, visible through a partially open door, contained a tight stand-up shower, toilet, and small vanity with mirror. Julia took it all in quietly. There was no judgment in her eyes, only assessment. She shifted the paper bag slightly in her hands. "Where in your apartment do you intend for us to eat our food, Brian?" she asked, intuitively. He met her gaze with a small smile. "We're not." She raised an eyebrow. On the wall opposite the entrance stood another door, nondescript, easy to overlook. "Just a few more steps," Brian said. He opened it to reveal a narrow stairwell leading upward. The climb was steeper than the one below, the space tighter. At the top was a simple hatch that opened onto the roof. Brian climbed first and offered his hand to help her through. When Julia stepped onto the rooftop, she paused again, this time not out of caution, but curiosity. The roof stretched modestly around them, edged by a low brick barrier. The skyline of the city glowed in the distance, lights flickering against the deepening blue of early night. A small table sat near the center, its surface weathered but sturdy. 2 wooden stools rested beneath it. A hammock hung securely between 2 reinforced posts. A few empty water bottles lay near one corner. On another small side table sat a couple of books, sealed carefully inside large Ziploc bags to protect them from the elements. The scene was simple, but deliberate. Brian walked ahead and began wiping down the table with a cloth he had tucked into his back pocket. Julia felt something soften inside her. This was not accidental. This was prepared. They sat down and opened their meals. For several minutes they spoke very little. Forks dipped into salad containers, the crinkle of chip bags punctuated the quiet. Every so often, one of them would glance up, meeting the other's eyes briefly before returning to their food. The silence wasn't empty. It was comfortable, measured. 2 people acclimating to one another's presence without rushing to fill space. Brian, unsurprisingly, finished first. His movements were efficient, deliberate but unhurried. Julia, more meticulous in her eating, continued savoring each bite. This extra time, unbeknownst to her, allowed Brian to prepare the next part of the evening. He rose quietly. "Sit tight," he said, placing his hand gently on her left arm. "I'll need a moment." She nodded, lifting her Diet Coke to her lips. At the far edge of the roof stood an old brick chimney, long unused. Near its base was a small metal hatch, once likely used for storing wood or coal, perhaps both. A padlock secured it. Ryan walked over and unlocked it. Inside rested a large black bag. Julia watched with open curiosity as he carried it back toward the table. He first removed a tripod and assembled it carefully, adjusting each leg for balance. Then he withdrew a telescope, not new, not sleek like those featured on science documentaries, but sturdy and functional. He attached it with steady hands. Julia finished her last forkful just as he made the final adjustment. "I believe it's ready now," Brian said softly. "Please, take a look." She stood and approached. The sky had darkened fully now, stars beginning to assert themselves against the backdrop of night. Julia leaned forward and looked through the telescope. Her breath caught. The sky expanded before her, distant lights sharpened into focus. Objects invisible to the naked eye revealed themselves in quiet brilliance. She had never done this before. Julia was a trial lawyer, a formidable one. Her world revolved around statutes, precedent, persuasion. Stargazing offered no strategic advantage in a courtroom. It had never demanded her attention. But now she stood silently, gazing upward for nearly 10 minutes. Brian stood beside her, not intruding, not explaining prematurely, just present, ready to adjust the lens if needed, answer any questions she might have. "Brian," she asked finally, still looking through the scope, "what are these 2 larger, brighter stars that are close together?" He smiled slightly. "Last year," he began, "I read a relationship book that forever altered my perception of how I view both men and women." Julia didn't move. She continued observing. The book explores the interpersonal dynamics between men and women, how they communicate differently, what their emotional needs are, how they cope. The author argues that men and women are fundamentally different, but if they're willing to put in the work and remain committed, they can coexist in a functional relationship. They can be happy together. Julia slowly lifted her head and looked at him. Her expression carried curiosity and mild confusion. She had asked about stars. He was discussing relationships. Brian noticed. He waited patiently until she returned her gaze to the telescope. "Those 2 larger, brighter spheres you're looking at," he continued gently, "are not stars. They're planets." A pause. "The book I mentioned, by John Gray, is called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus." She remained silent. "At this moment in time," he said, "you're looking at the western sky at an event that happens once every 2 to 3 years. You're looking at both Mars and Venus. in alignment. Julia stayed still for nearly 20 seconds. Mars and Venus. Planets, not stars. Different bodies, different orbits, occasionally aligned. When she finally lifted her head again, her expression had changed. The confusion was gone. In its place was understanding. Brian had just done something remarkable. Not through grandiosity or wealth or status. He had connected astronomy and human behavior in a way that felt effortless. He had told a story. He had taken something vast and abstract and made it intimate. Julia had always been complex, sophisticated, exceptionally intelligent. It took extraordinary effort to impress her. Brian, a delivery driver with a 20-year-old telescope, had just done so with a minute-long dialogue and a clear night sky. She turned toward him fully now. The city lights flickered behind them. The telescope stood quietly between them like a witness. For the first time that evening, she stepped closer. Not by accident, not by proximity of space, but by intention. "Can I kiss you, Brian?"